You have been listening to President Trump flanked by officials at the DOJ, his attorney general, his FBI director, answering a range of questions for about 40 minutes now. The event aimed at defending his administration's policy as it relates to sending the National Guard into various cities. I'm going to tick through some of the headlines here, and then we will go to our reporters who've been watching along with us. The press availability opened with the president saying, yes, he was open to potentially taking the World Cup away from Boston if Boston did not cooperate with their law enforcement efforts. Again, really digging in on his insistence that deploying the National Guard to these various cities has been an effective measure, making a fair amount of news as it relates to foreign policy on Venezuela. Of course, there have been those attacks against what the administration has called these drug boats. President Trump signaling he's prepared to expand that offensives. A reporter asking, are you considering strikes on land? The president saying, I don't want to tell you exactly, but we are certainly looking at land now because we've got the sea very well under control, and also appearing to confirm that he had, in fact, authorized the CIA to operate inside Venezuela. President Trump also making news on India, saying he's spoken to the Prime Minister Modi, who has, quote, assured me today that he won't buy oil from Russia. The president going on to say, now we got to get China to stop. Also saying he is preparing for his meeting on Friday with Ukraine's President Zelensky, and saying of Putin, I think he really wants to get a deal done. Also asked about his tariff policy. The president saying that you're in one now as it relates to a trade war with China, and drilling down and saying that his tariffs are a part of his national security policy. If we don't have tariffs, we don't have national security, the president saying. And then ending with a very long riff about Jack Smith, the special counsel who, of course, indicted him of various charges. Those were dropped once he won the presidency, taking all sorts of shots, not just at Jack Smith, but at the Justice Department under the Biden administration, saying that his DOJ is not weaponized, but that Biden's DOJ is not weaponized. Ryan, Reilly, I want to start with you on that point, because there was a lot that we just heard there coming from the Oval Office. What do people need to know? And it's notable he was talking about calling for his political enemies to be indicted or sought after in some way while being flanked by officials at DOJ.
Yeah, and not only that, but saying, if anything, they've been too soft on his political enemies. I thought that was notable. That's, it comes at a time he was expressly hitting at Adam Schiff there, because he's basically the only person who hasn't been indicted that's on the top of his list, or that, isn't expected to be indicted soon. We're all sort of thinking that there's going to be action in the John Bolton case, which will come soon. And of course, there's case and the James Comey case. So those are the sort of the top four, I think, that he's been arguing. But, notably, obviously, what they're talking about there is targeting an individual. And that's sort of what has been against Justice Department ethics. That's like really core to the Justice Department and what they're supposed to. You're not supposed to go after the man. You're supposed to go after the crime. Right. And so just this entire structure of him of him naming people that he wants to be targeted explicitly, and then sort of finding a crime on the back end, is sort of upends the entire thesis of the Justice Department. Well,
and part of what I had the vice president on Meet the Press this past weekend, and part of what I pressed him on was the optics. We have now, of course, seen Letitia James indicted, James Comey indicted. Two names on a public post that was meant to be a private message sent to Pam Bondi. And I pressed him on the optics of having directed her to effectively do this. Talk about the optics today of standing there in front of officials at the DOJ and essentially calling for all of his political enemies, naming them by name. to be indicted in some way or held accountable.
I mean, especially some of the controversies that we've seen in Justice Department history seem sort of quaint when you compare them to what's happening, in front of our eyes right now. Because remember, we spent all this time talking about the tarmac back in the day. Remember when Bill Clinton and the Attorney General ran into each other on tarmac and he briefly went into her plane? That became this months-long, years-long controversy because of the idea that Hillary Clinton was under investigation at the time. And now what you have is a scenario where they're openly talking about prosecuting people Donald Trump doesn't like altogether in the just optically. We've seen that at every stage so far, where Pam Bondi does her press conferences at the White House rather than the Justice Department. That sort of separation that we've seen post-Watergate has basically been obliterated.
It's a really important point. Monica, Alba, let me turn to you, because I thought some of the headlines as it relates to foreign policy were significant. Let's start with Venezuela. Again, just to reiterate what I said coming out of the president's remarks, it appeared as though he confirmed that he has authorized the CIA to go into Venezuela. What did you hear?
Yeah, and it's pretty striking anytime you have anybody confirming as sensitive of a potential operation like that. But when you have the President of the United States coming out and saying that, it takes on a whole new meaning. And certainly the president has not been shy about sharing his wishes, desires, and goals when it comes to Venezuela, when it comes to going after what he says are these boats that are carrying loads of drugs headed for the United States. But he is now going beyond that and saying that there are these additional what would be covert operations that he has or had approved when it comes to Venezuela and being on the ground there. Now, he was also asked by a reporter whether he would authorize the CIA to potentially act in support of overthrowing the Maduro regime. And the president said that he wouldn't answer that or speculate on that specifically, that it essentially wouldn't be wise for him to do so. But all of this comes, Kristen, as our colleagues are reporting that there is mounting frustration from some lawmakers because they are demanding answers about these exact strikes that we're talking about. And they say they haven't gotten complete information. They want to see unedited videos, for instance, of some of those strikes that have been partially released on the president's social media platform. But they want a lot more information about what's happening here, the rationale, the decision making, some of the intelligence. And they say simply that they just haven't gotten that yet. So that, I thought, really stood out to me. And then on Gaza, which is the other foreign policy headline here that we're all wondering about, Kristen, it's notable the president continues to say that Hamas needs to disarm, needs to lay down their weapons, and needs to hand over the remains of those hostages that died in Hamas captivity or were taken into Gaza after the October 7th terrorist attack. The president says that this is a very complicated process, as we know, that Hamas has to be going through rubble in some instances, tunnels, some of which have been destroyed, to try to go through that painstaking process. But the president is saying that Hamas needs to do that. Otherwise, there are very significant questions about what will happen next with his own peace plan that he's trying to implement and trying to see. But he is saying that it could be perhaps violent and that Israel would be the one to disarm Hamas, but that the U.S. could help Israel potentially support them through weapons or other means. But the president was quick to point out he's not implying that any U.S. troops would get involved. He's saying that that would not be what you would see militarily, even though it was CENTCOM today that put out a message publicly urging Hamas to stop doing what it's doing and to continue to focus on the next phases of this 20-point peace.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Monica. He said, quote, "We won't need the U.S. military to get Hamas to give up its weapons." It was notable. With the last minute we have left here, Monica, something he touched on. A judge blocked the layoffs that the administration was trying to enact. We didn't hear a whole lot about that during this Q&A with the president, but what can you tell us? What's the status of those sweeping layoffs that had been announced last week?
Yeah, and this is all related to those RIFs, reductions in force, which we know the OMB director, Russ Vought, put into action when the shutdown started, and it did affect so far about 4,000 federal workers in multiple key government agencies. We're talking about HHS, we're talking about the Department of Education, Energy, Interior, Commerce, and others, and beyond that. But now we know through legal action that was very quickly filed, at least a judge for now has halted those, has temporarily blocked those. We know there will likely be an appeal. But what's also significant related to that is that today, Kristen, we heard from the OMB director who said that this is just a snapshot of what they plan for those layoffs for federal workers, and that in the end, as this shutdown continues to stretch on, it could be north of 10,000 federal employees that are ultimately affected by this, though it will likely face more legal challenges.
All right, Monica and Ryan, thanks so much to you both. We really appreciate it.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.